Alright, so welcome again everybody. For this section we're going to be talking specifically about the philosophy of lean thinking and kind of understanding the premise of lean. This is the first section for it. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be going over a couple kind of key ideas here. The first one is this notion of customer first thinking. Then we're going to talk a little bit about people and the role they play as the most valuable organizational resource. We're going to talk about Kaizen. Some of you may have heard of that, others maybe not. We're going to talk a little bit on how we decide where we want to focus our efforts, and then the last thing we're going to hit on really is how do we make sure we're kind of all moving forward together. Then beyond that, in the next section, we're going to talk again about how we kind of take this thinking and then put it into action. So first thing again, going back to the very beginning, so what is lean? And at its very core, when you strip everything out, the very basic concept of an idea of lean, what we really want to accomplish with it, is we want to be able to give our customer exactly what they want, when they want it, in the quantity they want it, and in the price they're willing to pay for it. And so how do we accomplish that? Well, in the Lean Concepts world, we embody this idea with the notion of customer first thinking. And so customer first thinking really, when we drill it down a little bit further, one of the things we do to make sure that we have good customer first thinking is we try to make sure that we're not passing any defects to our customer. Pretty straightforward. We also want to make sure we're meeting the customer's exact order immediately. We don't want to ship them something they kind of wanted 3 months from now. We want to make sure that we're getting them exactly what they want, really when they want it. And then again, coming back, that last idea of price being determined by the customer. And this one in particular is a little bit of a departure from kind of the traditional understanding of how we set price. So in a more traditional model, we kind of assume that we've got a fixed cost. Our cost is our cost. That kind of is what it is. And so the price comes from our determination of how much profit we want to make. So if we want to make a little more profit, we need a higher margin. That means the price goes up. Well, with good customer first thinking, we understand that the customer sets the price, and then the way we go about increasing our profit is by driving our costs down. Right? So it kind of reinforces this notion of the price being determined by the customer. So the next question most people ask is, well, who's the customer? Which is the right question to be asking. And one of the things that I always like to talk about, because the easiest one is, okay, well, it's the person on the other end of the phone, or the person writing the PO, or the person waiting for that UPS package. But to really get the most benefit out of what we're doing, we've got to drill that a little bit deeper, think a little bit deeper about it. And so I always like to define the customer, kind of in the Lean Concepts understanding of it, as really any person, thing, group, process that requires information or material from you should be considered a customer whose needs you want to try and meet. So that kind of leaves us with the end customer, the external customer, but then we've also got many, many, many internal customers. And the next person down the assembly line, the next person in the department that handles that particular form or piece of paperwork after we do, right? So if we can focus on meeting those customers' needs, and they can focus on meeting their customers' needs, eventually by the time everything gets out the door, we've met the needs of our final end customer the most effective way possible, right? That's the kind of cascading thinking behind why we want to focus on meeting every customer's need. And so really, in meeting those needs, we recognize in the Lean Concepts organization, in that culture, we recognize that the most valuable resource in doing that are people. And that's because more than, capital, equipment, tools, machines, people want to make a valuable contribution to the world, to their work, to their process. They want to take pride in what they do. And really, we understand that with the proper time, training, tools, resources, that anyone can do almost anything, right? That's the wonderful thing about the human resource and people, is that they have the ability to learn and to do and to grow. And so one of the things we do is we want to make sure that we're cultivating and capitalizing on the greatest resource our organization has by providing challenging work, a stimulating work environment, promotion, growth opportunities, and we really represent kind of this thinking of how we cultivate this resource with the key idea of respect for people. And you're going to hear me hit on that and bring that up pretty consistently, because that is a fundamental tenet of a lean organization, is really respecting the people of the organization and respecting their capability so that we can allow them to be as successful as possible. And so digging a little bit deeper into kind of this notion of respect for people, right? You know, it's something that's pretty common to understand, but something that gets lost a lot of times is that really only people can learn and create new things, and most importantly, solve problems. And so to that end, when you really look at it, you know, 9 times out of 10 in a practical sense, human capability outweighs machine capability. You know, one of the things we talk a lot about to people when we're discussing lean transformations, working with team members on the line, is people tend to say, oh, lean, more efficiency, you're going to replace me with a robot. And the thing I always tell them and reply with is say, you know, robots don't solve problems. Machines don't solve problems. So the most valuable aspect of people is not something that you can outsource with machinery. What we have to do as a lean culture is find a way to capitalize on that. And so again, going back to how do we actually do this? You know, how do we respect our people? What does that look like when we do that? Well, there's a couple things just off the top. You know, we want to make sure that they've got a safe working environment, right? Respect their health, respect their well-being. Challenging, stimulating work. You know, we want to make sure that we're actually using their full potential. You know, job security. We don't want people to be worried about whether or not they've got a job today or tomorrow. We need to respect them enough to let them know that they're appreciated, they have a place, and their contributions are valued. And then kind of the last thing that I just listed up here quickly is, you know, a job that adds value. You know, we don't want to take a perfectly talented individual and sit them in a corner and have them watch a stopwatch or something per se. Something that could easily be done by a machine. You know, that's not respecting that person's capability. So, you know, the kind of the next thing I like to talk a little bit about is the role of management, particularly in developing that human resource, right? That's one of our primary aims from a philosophical standpoint. It's something we've got to be effective at doing if we're really going to get the most out of the resources in our organization. So, if you take a look at, you know, the human resource and the relationship of management to that resource, really the key roles of management is not so much doing things directly and solving things directly and being involved directly, but the role of management in a lean organization is more to motivate that human resource, your team members, the people, you know, on the ground floor that are affecting the processes on a day-to-day basis, motivate and develop that resource so that we can then leverage that to actually make positive improvements, you know, in the materials, methods, tools, the way the organization runs. Right? So that's another key thing. You know, as management, we want to make sure we step back and we develop our people so that they can make those improvements. Because, you know, in a good organization, you have 7 to 10, 15 team members, in some cases more, in some cases less, but you always have more team members than managers. And so if we can cultivate that resource where those team members can be making that improvements, think about the amount of leverage it gives us. So, kind of the key point out of that is really what I like everyone to take away from this is that when you have capable people that we can successfully motivate, that's really one of the fundamental planks in building an effective organization. So, kind of that next idea that we're going to talk a little bit about is Kaizen. And some people have heard about it, some people haven't. It's one of those terms that's synonymous with continuous improvement. Because that's really kind of the thinking behind it. But what Kaizen is in our concept is it's really the primary method that our greatest resource, you know, our people, uses to actually accomplish customer first thinking, meeting our customers' needs. So Kaizen is the tool that, you know, our human resource uses to help satisfy our customers' requirements. And really what it looks like when you break it down is to say, okay, we've established some current condition, you know, where we are now, we've set a target for where we'd like to go, and we understand that there's some gap, right? We're not where we want to be just yet. Kaizen is that method that through kind of gradual continuous improvement that we close that gap, we reach our targets. And so one other thing, you know, that I like to talk about kind of is the Kaizen Bridge. And really what that bridge does is it's the link between customer first thinking and human development. And so when we develop people through new projects and challenges and problem solving, what that really does is it grows their capability and it grows the organization's ability to kind of meet the goals of customer first thinking. So kind of these first 3 ideas we've talked about are all very intertwined kind of in the lean concepts world. So kind of the next thing, that we'll talk about is this idea of accountability and how accountability for an organization plays into its ability to effectively improve. And so, really it kind of ties back into, looking at how we can effectively build that Kaizen bridge, right? Because with that, we can grow our people, we can meet our customers' needs. So what we want to say is, we don't want management to try and take shortcuts and solve every problem and go around and get to a place where you have a few key individuals that put the burden on themselves and they're the ones that make the world go round, right? We want to try and get away from that because one person can only do so much, right? So that's why we want to try and get away from it. But where we want to get to is that the improvements are actually coming from the bottom up. So it's not an idea that comes from a boardroom that with people that don't have direct involvement with what's going on. We really want the ideas and the improvement to be driven at the ground floor by the team members and the experts that are actually adding value to our processes and products. By the flip side, accountability has to come from the top down, right? So the role of management kind of in this sense is to make sure that we're meeting goals, to make sure that we're on schedule, to make sure that all the team members are living up to their commitments and obligations, and really to help everybody kind of stay on the same page. And kind of the key idea that I like to use a lot for this is this idea of inspecting what you expect, right? And it sounds kind of simple, maybe a little goofy, but where that comes from is that as management, if we aren't inspecting what's happening, we have no way of knowing if we're actually going to be meeting our expectations. So I would just kind of paraphrase it down to inspect what you expect. This idea of being accountable, checking, making sure that we're on schedule, we're making progress. That's what the role of management needs to be focused on. And so kind of out of that, in order to make this effective, leadership buy-in, that management buy-in to the idea of lean, to this culture, to what we're trying to accomplish is fundamentally critical to making this whole thing work. Because even if you've got the most motivated people, the greatest human resource in the world, and they're suggesting improvements and they're trying to get things done, if you don't have management that's bought in and holding that level of accountability, you grow unevenly, you have things that move at fits and starts and pieces pull, and eventually people get discouraged and the initiative will fall apart. So that leadership buy-in is critical to be able to sustain any progress as we move forward. So, we talk a little bit about, Kaizen and the human resource and customer first thinking and kind of how that's all related, but to bring it back, again, to respecting people, it's a key idea, hit on it from a couple different angles. Kaizen and something we communicate to our team members is that Kaizen, this idea of continuous improvement, is not working themselves out of a job, it's really about them. Because with Kaizen, with this opportunity for improvement, you have every team member every day working on new projects and plans and ideas and solving problems that add value to the customer. It's stimulating for them. They're growing and developing personally and professionally. They're improving the safety of their work environment. And really, when it's implemented, the thinking behind it is Kaizen is a tool and an opportunity for the individual team members to make their involvement within the organization more rewarding, personally and professionally. So, now that we kind of know what Kaizen is, how we use it, why we want to do it, the next question that comes up is, okay, well, where do we use it? We have a whole organization, we have problems everywhere. How do we pick where to go first? And the simple answer to that is we want to focus on where the value is added. And in the lean world, value-added activities only take place on the shop floor. And shop is in quotes because shop could be a physical plant, it could be an office, it could be, out in the field, it could really be anywhere that value is being added. And when we talk about value, it's something that directly contributes to the product that we are creating. So value-added work would be, adding a screw to a machine on an assembly line. It would be filling out a necessary form on a document that has to be filed in a process. Non-value-added stuff would be maybe repairing something that got damaged, or an extra layer of management, or an extra meeting that maybe we don't need, right? That's just kind of the distinction. So we want to focus on what's actually necessary to build what our customer has ordered. Kind of the other things that we get out of this, and the reason why we want to focus there, is that's really the proof of current condition. And current condition is another kind of key idea that we'll get to too. But what we mean by current condition is what's happening right now. What's the status as of right now? And the reason current condition is important is that the shop floor, things within an organization are always changing. Everyone is always learning new ways to do things, changing the way they do it, materials change, processes change. And so if we're not focusing on where the activities are actually taking place, if we're just merely going by what we think is happening or what we knew was happening 6 months ago, you can see how you can pretty quickly start running in circles with that. So it's important to see what's actually going on, where important, valuable work is actually being done. And that kind of comes back to this idea of respect for people. And people are team members on the front lines as experts, and that's really because they know more than anybody else in the organization what they do in their process. They're the experts. That's a resource and information that we can cultivate to be more effective at how we plan and change and improve. And the key idea that really represents all this is go and see. Simple phrase, straightforward. Ask it all the time. Did you go? Did you see? Go and see to confirm with your own eyes what's really happening before we start making assumptions and try and start building on, what we think versus what's actually happening. So when we talk about moving forward together, right? There's a kind of a couple key ideas here, and we know what we want to do, which is really kind of meet our customers' demands exactly. We know kind of what we need to do it, and that's where we get into developing our human resource to be able to do that. We know how to do it. We build that Kaizen Bridge. We use the tools of Kaizen to be able to close that gap. And we know where to do it. We want to focus on where the value-added work is actually taking place. But the last thing we really want to talk about is how do we actually make sure that we're doing this together. And that's where kind of these couple ideas come into. We've got this a tool that we'll talk about here shortly called kind of Vantage Planning and Hoshin Planning. They go together. And really what that means is, as a team, we've really got to understand, where we're going, why we're going there, and what's the ultimate goal. What are we trying to accomplish? And, when we look at, okay, well, how can we communicate that? How can we make sure that everyone's on the same page? We've got a quick tool called the Performance Matrix that kind of ties together these ideas of Vantage Planning and incorporates the idea of Hoshin with that. And so, really what the Performance Matrix does is it's a tool that we use to kind of align the thinking, right? And beyond that, driving the objectives out of good thinking at each level within an organization. So from the top all the way to the bottom, and the bottom all the way to the top. And so this is a sample performance matrix. It's very generic. I always encourage everybody not to get hung up, on the technicalities of the words, because it's the thinking that's important. This is just the generic template. So you've got a couple different vantage levels. The biggest is philosophical up at the top, getting sequentially more specific as you go down, all the way to tactical down at the bottom. And kind of the scope of control reflects that. So at the very top level, it's the big picture stuff, the ideals, the vision. And then from each level, we want to be able to drill that down to the bottom, which are kind of the specific daily activities. And, again, not so coincidentally, these individual levels kind of correlate directly with different management levels. So we know, it's the typical responsibility of the president to create the vision for the organization, where it's headed. The vice president, then the manager, then the supervisor, and then down to the team member level, they're the ones carrying out the daily activities that need to be focused on accomplishing that big picture vision. And that's really what we mean. So when you start at the president, you develop a vision, and then it's the vice president's responsibilities to say, okay, what are some specific goals for me and my department that will help meet that vision? And then when you break it down to the manager level, you say, okay, as a manager, I know what my vice president's goals are. What are some specific, they're called missions, but it's the same thing as goals, really. So what are the specific accomplishments I need to do to be able to meet the goals of my supervisor? You break it down again underneath the manager. Okay, for the supervisor, all right, well, what do my team members need to be doing day to day to meet these accomplishments that my manager needs met? And then again down to the team member, okay, well what do I need to be doing every minute of every day to make sure that I'm meeting the goals that have been laid out for me by my supervisor? And the end result is, if we do this right, and it's organized appropriately so that goals are focused on meeting the goal above them, then as the daily activities at the very bottom are being carried out, they meet the missions of their supervisor, which accomplishes the goals and accomplishments of the manager, which meets the goals of the vice president, which ultimately then accomplishes the true vision of the president. And that's where this idea of Hoshin comes from, aligning goals top to bottom and bottom to top. And if kind of the key idea out of this, and this is one of the things that can be a little bit more technical, get a little bit more confusing, but the key takeaway from this is that we want to make sure that every activity that every person at every level of the organization that they're doing every day is focused towards accomplishing the overall broad objectives of the organization. We don't want half the company working on something that's not relevant to where we're trying to go, right? We're just going to spin our wheels that way. So, the performance matrix is a way we can write it down and just make sure we're keeping track of everything, and so that everyone's working towards the same goals. So, kind of then just the basic summary for what we covered in this webinar is, what do we want to do with customer first thinking? We want to meet our customers' exact expectations. And then when we look at, well, okay, how do we do that? What do we need to do that? Okay, well, we know that we need to develop our human resource and respect our people to be able to accomplish that customer first thinking. And we say, okay, well, how are we going to do that? Well, we use this idea of Kaizen, continuous improvement, to develop that resource to meet the requirements of good customer first thinking. We know where we want to do this now. We want to focus on where the value is added. And then we say, well, how do we make sure we do it together? Well, we use that idea of Hoshin Planning, the performance matrix. There's some other tools like that, but the key thing is we want every person at every level, every minute of every day, working towards the same objectives and big picture goals. And if we can do that, we can be the most effective organization possible. And then for the next section, we'll talk about how we put all this thinking into real world action.